Hey everybody, welcome to Limited Level Ups, episode 65, Innistrad Midnight Hunt, State of the Format address. We're live on Twitch as always, and this is the episode that we like to do every format where we take a big snapshot of the format, where we currently are. I break down some thoughts on the format as, we're 2 weeks in, some thoughts on decks, some thoughts on individual cards, and potentially, where things are going, essentially, just to get you give you some context, kind of calibrate you to where things are and how to better navigate your drafts. Usually this episode comes about, 4 or 5 days after the set comes out, but I was on Lords Limited this time around with Ben filling in for Ethan, and I figured, there's no reason for me to reiterate my takes a day later, so I figured give it some time for the format to mature, for us to talk about, have this episode, and now we get to get a snapshot on what I think is the first big meta shift of the format. Now that there's a lot more information out there, people kind of know the baselines that blue, black, and white are really good, and red and green are lesser colors. So now that I don't think it's just strictly right to force blue black or blue white anymore. There's a lot more space to explore. So that's what we're gonna get into today. Just before we jump in, of course, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the place you can go if you want to support the show, or honestly, if you want to support anything I do, any of my content. If you like my articles, you like the stream, you like the podcast, the best way to support me directly, of course, if you choose to support, we're going to give you back some rewards. There's Discord rewards, there's coaching rewards. I've been swamped with coaching in the past week. I've just had 2 sessions per day at least, because it's a new set, people want to get all the info. Maybe that hype has died down a little bit, but it's not long before the next set comes out. It's 6 weeks or something. So if that's something you're interested in, especially a few coaching sessions, that's the best way to get value out of the Patreon and out of if you're interested in coaching. So check it out. Of course, the Discord for Limited Level Ups, command Discord in the chat, or bits.ly/join the Discord, Cord spelled CHORD. That's free to anybody. I really do think it's a great place to get better at Limited. There's so many really, really nice and really smart people over there that'll help you out. Go through your draft logs, go through your gameplay logs. If there's anything that Magic players love, it's talking about Magic and, showing you just how good they are at the game. And so there's a lot of people over there looking to do that. So check that out. And without further ado, we will jump in. So the agenda for today, we're going to do a meta breakdown, a look at just what decks are performing, what decks have maybe come up in the, in the rankings. We're going to look at some archetype tiers where, after we look at the actual data of the meta breakdown, just talking about where I see each of the archetypes, why they are underperforming, why they're overperforming, maybe where there's a few decks in there that I think people are misbuilding slightly, and that's why they might be underperforming a little bit. We're going to talk about some big picture thoughts, just general thoughts about the format, good practices, best practices for the format that you can carry through any archetype you're drafting, thoughts about each deck. Draft navigation is a huge one, and now that we're kind of in the space of, the cards, the archetypes, the next big thing is understanding how to come out of every draft alive and with a good deck. And I think that's just a huge skill for any format that doesn't get talked about all that often. Kind of having a roadmap for every deck, every draft. So we're going to talk about that. My roadmap for the format. Humble brag, we in the past week we've been hovering around 1 to 5, number 1 to number 5 mythic. So I found a lot of success in the format. I feel very confident in just I'm very happy about how the format's been treating me, and so I just want to share my thoughts and the draft navigation, how I've been navigating each draft. And of course, the last thing we're going to do, just talk about some individual cards. I think there's some cards that are still overrated, some cards that are still underrated. There's some junkers in this set that I feel like I see way more often on the battlefield than I would expect, so I definitely want to touch on those. And of course, for chat at the end here, we're going to be doing a Q&A so anytime that if there's anything you want me to expand on, anything you want me to elaborate on, hold your questions to the end and we'll get to them after. Okay, so let's look at a metagame breakdown just quickly here, just looking at the win rates of each deck in the format. So the winners are still Dimir, Zombies, and Azorius Disturb, right? These are just the 2 clear best decks in the format. And actually, it's worth noting that I don't think everybody has Azorius Blue-White as up there with blue-black. Blue-black got a lot of heat early on from me, from LSV, who were both like forcing the deck essentially to get to high mythic, and that deck's great. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very good. But I think in that hype, how good blue-white is got a little bit lost. And actually, it's winning at almost not a full percentage, but it's winning at 59.1% of the time amongst 17 lands users. Where Dimir right now, this is a screenshot of or a snapshot of today, is winning at 58.7%. So it's pretty darn close, but Azorius is winning a little bit more. I think part of that is Azorius has a pretty good matchup against Dimir, which is the other best deck in the format. But just worth noting that if you're not on the train of blue-white is also a great deck, then get on that train and be very willing to get into blue-white. And we'll talk about blue-white as we go on to the podcast. Other decks here, Rakdos at 54, very middle of the pack. Gruul, of course, you know, the big joke of this format is that it's the werewolf set, and Gruul is by far the worst deck. Like, 51% is really, really bad compared to the other decks. We have Selesnya, green-white, pretty good deck. Black-white's another good deck. Black-white's a really interesting deck where I think early on we were kind of grouping all the Esper decks together as, you know, best decks. But I have found that blue-white and black-blue are actually quite a bit better than black-white. I like black-white still. I think it's a decent deck. But I'm not as jazzed to get into it as the other decks, essentially. Which, you know, is just a very small tiebreaker thing in the draft. It doesn't often, you know, it doesn't actually make me make meaningful decisions all that often. But a lot of times it's like, okay, well, I can take this good. You know, I've taken a white card, pick one, pack one, and then I can take a blue card or a black card the next pick. Well, I'll probably take the blue card, and that's just like a tiebreaker thing. I've been just like a little bit less impressed with Orzhov. I just found it's a little bit small ball, a little bit like, you know, you have to really grind to get your edges, whereas like the blue, white, and the blue cards just kind of do their thing. Then we've got Golgari, green-black, which honestly, it's winning at 55.1%, which surprises me, because I've never once been impressed with the green-black deck. Well, I'm going to get into a little bit why I think it's winning this much after, but the synergies in green-black just like don't exist. It's as green-black always is. It's like a card quality deck where it's like, oh sweet, I have good green cards and good black cards. Let's put them in a deck together. We got Simic, which is a deck I like a lot. It's winning at 57.9%. Is it at 52.5? That's a deck I want to talk about too. And Boros, red-white at 54.7. So just in a you know, a little bit of a snapshot there. The big picture thing to look at here is I think that blue is the best color in the format. That's kind of what this data is telling us. And that lines up with my intuition as well, where I'm very happy to be in any blue archetype, including blue-red. Just starting with blue cards makes me feel good. And another small thing meta-wise is I think that people know that blue and black are both very good. But I think that people, especially kind of like less invested drafters, haven't quite caught on to just how good some of the blue commons are. Like, I think Revenge of the Drowned is a really good example, where I've seen a lot of people look at that card and be like, oh, isn't that just like a bounce spell? When it's just, you know, it's basically, you know, it's Elrond's Epiphany. Well, I guess that's not really a fair comparison, because Elrond's Epiphany costs 6 or 7, and Drown only costs 4, but it's a really, really great card. One of the best commons in the set, and people don't take that card. And there's a few other blue cards where people are undervaluing them, even though they know that blue is really good. So early on, I'm looking to get into blue more than black, because people know the black removal spells are good. They're contested, right? You often get people like picking up the black removal spells early. In fact, if you look at the data on 17 lands of average taken at and average last seen at, I believe both of them are, if you sort by commons, all 3 common black removal spells are the top taken cards, both by 17 lands users and by the arena community at large. So, you know, if people get into black more often than blue, so it means that I'm more likely to start blue than black. Okay, so some big picture thoughts here. The colors, of course. Like we talked about here, it's we already went over this a little bit, but it's really the defining factor of this format is it's an Esper versus red-green world, where I'm just so much happier to start in blue, black, or white than I am to start in red or green. There's a lot of reasons for that. You know, just card quality is a large one. Just at common, green doesn't have that many good commons, red doesn't have that many good commons. I do want to talk about red as a color. And a thought that I had when I was putting this presentation together is that I think in a world now where people are less willing to draft red, and this is, you know, that's because red was really overdrafted early on because a lot of people went in being like, okay, it's the werewolf set, let's jump in green as well, right? So these colors have gotten a bit of a boost now that there's more information, and people won't be taking the green and red cards as highly because they know werewolves is not a good deck. So we've kind of gotten to the point where I think that red is certainly draftable. I feel okay being in red, whereas like a week or two ago I've been like, no, past that mythic dragon, take an organ hoarder. You know, these days I think that red is often sufficiently open enough that I think it's good enough. Same with green. And a thought I had was, I wonder if red is just the second worst color in this format, not the actual worst color. Because I know a lot of people, including myself, were saying red's just terrible, red's atrocious. But the more I've played with red and the more I've played with green, the more I'm more impressed with the red commons and less impressed with my green decks. Usually my good green decks, my trophy and green decks, have a very light green splash. They are just touching green, and they're like green-white with a lot of white cards, or green-blue with a lot of green cards. One of the interesting things about 17 land data is when you're looking by color pairs, it doesn't separate exactly how much green or how much red you're playing in a deck, right? So I think that a heavy red deck is actually a lot better than a heavy green deck, just by virtue of there are more red cards I'm happier to put in my deck at common than there are green cards at common that I'm happy to. And so I think what's happening a lot of the times is the green cards pair well with the whites, the blue, and the black cards better than the red cards do. So what happens is you pick up a few green cards, right, that pair well with the Esper cards. You play green-white, or you play, green-blue or something. That deck's pretty good, and it's winning at a higher tick than the red decks are. But I think if your deck is heavy red, it can be pretty good because there's a lot of commons I'm happy to put in my deck, especially commons that often wheel, and we'll get into them here. I just think it doesn't pair as well with the other colors, which is why those decks might be winning a little bit less, which is really interesting. So just to get into some talk here, what does red do really well? And this is based on some of the data, but also based on just my intuition. And the removal spells is the big answer here, right? Moonrager Slash, Burn the Accursed, Neonate's Rush. I think that all of these are cards I'm pretty happy to put in my deck. The Moonrager Slash is obviously just a generically good card, just 3 mana deal 3, sometimes costs 1. Burn the Accursed is a card that overperforms for this class of card, just like the 5 mana deal 5. It also deals 2 to the face, and it also exiles, which is really relevant. And then the one that I think is going to turn some heads is Neonate Rush. I think this card is actually pretty good, and I'm happy to play multiple copies of it. If you got vampires, of course. So this is the Neonate's Rush is 2 red for an instant, costs 1 less if you have a vampire, and it deals 1 damage to target creature, 1 damage to its controller, you draw a card. So the big thing about this card, there's a few things going on here. But the big thing is that there's a lot of high value 1 toughness creatures in this format, right? You've got Scob Wrangler, you've got Ecstatic Awakener, you've got Lunarch Veteran, right? You just go down the list of cards in the set, and it's a lot of some of the best cards in the set, honestly. And so the times that you can get a 2-for-1 with this card, and often the card you want to kill is a 1 toughness creature, it's a really, really good deal, because you're spending 2 or 3 mana to get a 2-for-1 that kills a creature, an onboard 2-for-1 plus draw a card. An onboard kill something plus you draw a card. So this card has gone from, I probably don't want to put this card in my deck, to, I probably just want multiple copies of this card in my deck if I have vampires. The chip damage matters too. Sometimes you have minor vampire synergies. The casting a spell matters, just being a spell matters for blue-red. Being an instant matters for decks that need to hold a mana instant speed. So yeah, I mean, all 3 of these cards I'm actually pretty happy about putting in my deck. And the big thing that has changed, like I said before, is that you get the red cards a little bit later now. Whereas before, you just it just wasn't happening, right? I remember a draft I had where I was trying to be in red because I opened a red bomb. I opened the dragon, the Moonveil Regent, and I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna take a few red cards, and then I got to pick 4, and there was Abandon the Post, which is the 2 creatures can't block this turn, Stolen Vitality, which is the pump spell, and some other medium red common. I'm like, okay, I think out of this pack I can wheel this Abandon the Post, and we're gonna get a brew going hot here. None of them wheeled. And that's despite the fact that we were a week into the format, and I think it was known that red was not a very good color. I think that has changed now. I think that has shifted. Limited Resources has done a good job of getting all that information out there, and I think people are a little bit less likely to draft red. The other good thing that red does in the format is it has this nice package of just like cheap red cards that deal a lot of damage. So not only are its removal spells pretty good, but its core just like cheap deal damage with creatures package is pretty good. So Voldarin Stinger, single red mana, 1 mana vampire, has first strike as long as it's attacking, and you can pay 3 mana to give it +2 until end of turn. Really good 1-drop on turn 1 for pushing damage early. Turns on your Neonate's Rush. A really big one here is Festival Crasher. So this is 1 red for a 1/3. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Festival Crasher gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And this is just like a kill you out of nowhere card. I've been really impressed with this card when I've been experimenting with my red decks. You know, it plays really well with combat tricks, plays really well with removal spells, plays really well with stuff like Consider, just like, your Consider turns into 1 mana, pump this, draw a card, sometimes bin flashback or embalm card, or sorry, not embalm, that's the other set, a disturb card. And so these are my 2 creatures of choice in red, just like super cheap, super low to the ground. And then I pair those often with removal spells, of course, but also Abandon the Post, which is red-white for a sorcery. Up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn. Flashback 4 mana. This is specifically good with Festival Crasher because you're just getting a lot of damage, a lot of unblockable damage. And then Stolen Vitality, which is 1 red instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. If it's your turn against trample, otherwise against first strike. Again, pushes a lot of damage. Nothing like when your opponent attacks with Festival Crasher on turn 3, turn 4. Often there's not a lot that can block profitably if you think they have Stolen Vitality, because the Crasher becomes a a 4/4 trample. So the Crasher is often going to get in a bunch of Threat of Activation damage, and yeah, Stolen Vitality also just finishes games with the Stinger or with the Crasher. So that's like 7 commons, and there's even like 1 or 2 more in there that I haven't talked about. That's 7 red commons that I like, right? That I'm like happy to put in my deck. And then we can go to the uncommons too. We've got Play with Fire, Thermal Alchemist, Lunar Frenzy. These are all pretty premium cards. I like all of them. Red also kind of plays this burn game a lot of the time, where it's just like, all right, I sit back. I don't have to be super aggressive, like attacking you every turn. I just sit back with my Thermal Alchemists and my burn spells. There's a lot of damage that goes to the face in this set. Lunar Frenzy goes to the face. Play with Fire goes to the face, right? Well, Lunar Frenzy doesn't really go to the face, but it effectively does, right? So there are some pretty good red commons, and like I said before, if you pair all of these red commons together and uncommons together, they just like form this nice package in a way that green's commons don't, right? And then of course, red does some other good things. It's got good rares, a few good rares. Moonveil Regent, Burn Down the House, Reckless Stormseeker. I would first pick all of these cards, try to go into a red deck. Like I said, I'm pretty happy to go into a red deck at this point, and these are cards that would get me in there. I want to be clear, my baseline is still, I should be blue, white, or black, starting off. But these are the type of cards that would get me to draft a red deck early on if I open them. Or, I've gotten past Burn Down the Houses and Moonveil Regents because people are still in the red is terrible mode, So let's look at the other worst color. And again, like I was saying, I think I might have green as a worse color in a vacuum than red. I think it maybe does pair better with the good colors than red does, but the commons just suck. Like, I'm not happy with the commons in green. So the best commons are like Eccentric Farmer, right? 3 mana 2/3, you mill 3, then you get a land from your grave. Shadow Beast Sighting, 4 mana 4/4 token, and like Harvest Tide's Entry, which is like the 2 mana 3/1 Coven, can't be blocked by power 2 or less if you have Coven. And that's like it. There's a few auxiliary things like the Fight spell can be okay, but these alone, like these ones just I'm not that happy about in general. Like Farmer's good, don't get me wrong, but it's honestly a card I can wheel a lot of the time. So when I'm green, I often want to be there because of higher rarity cards being uncommons and rares. And to be fair, green has a lot of really good uncommons. It's got Contortionist Troop, which is the X creature that puts counters on things. Clear Shot is a premium removal spell. Rise of the Ants is super, super good. Just like, I think this is honestly an underrated card in the sense that like, it is one of the best uncommons in the set, and I see it going late, and people take it late based on 17 lands. Death Bonnet Sprout, the 1 mana 1/1 that like flips if you have 3 creatures in your grave. And Dawnheart Mentor is actually a card I really want to call out. This is the 2 and a green 0/4. And it says when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 Coven, 5 and a green, Target creature gets +3/+3 until and trample until end of turn. Activate only if you have Coven. This is a card I've been really impressed with. Like, in any deck. In a defensive green deck, in an aggressive green deck, like, it gets you 2/3 of the way to Coven, and if they can't kill this, or you're not just, like, you know, super dead because they're pressuring you extremely hard, this is going to take over the game. So it both, like, stabilizes you really well, gets you to Coven, and gives you this awesome win condition. Actually very similar to Rise Advance. Rise Advance obviously doesn't come down early, but it stabilizes you super well and gives you this thing that wins the game. So this is what green does well, and of course the other thing that green does very, very well is it's got some busto rares, like truly absurd rares. Renin 7, Tovalar's Huntmaster, which is the green Grave Titan. It's got the Blob Mythic. So there are really good reasons to move into green. I would just say that I would be careful about how many green cards I want to pick up when I'm navigating the draft. Often when I get into green, I open up a green bomb. I take this green bomb and then I try to pair it with one of the better colors often. You know, you can if you pick up all the good uncommons, it's great. But just be aware that green's commons will not support you in drafting a good deck alone, right? They will help. They will be supplementary to your higher rarity cards, but they don't get there alone, I would say. And so, like I was saying before, what does green do well? I think it does pair with the other colors quite well. Green-white, the green cards add a lot to the green-white go-wide stuff, right? The gold, this is mostly gold cards, but like Join the Dance, Dawn Wardens, Winterthorn Blessing in blue-green. I really like this card, so this is the put a counter on something, tap something, and it has flashback. So I think that what green does lack in card quality at common, it makes up for by pairing well with the good colors and adding synergies that are greater than the sum of the parts in the ways that red doesn't do that, right? Red doesn't add that much to the base white decks. It doesn't add that much to the base blue decks. It adds something, but I think not as much as the green cards. So that's the way, one of the ways I would explain why the green decks are winning at a little bit of a higher tick, even though I think it is potentially a worse color. Okay, so some other format thoughts as we go into it, just past the archetype stuff. This is just general good practices, ways I'm drafting my decks. Big things die. This is a really important concept in this format, and a reason that I'm not including stuff like Morkrut Behemoth in my deck, which is the 5 mana 7/6 that you have to sacrifice something to pay, or you pay 7 mana, has Menace. Tireless Hauler, the big green dummy vigilant creature with Daybound, Nightbound, flips into a 6/6, is a 4/5 on the front side. One of the reasons that Werewolves is such an underperforming deck is that whole shtick is I'm full of big green dummies that are trying to overpower you. But that doesn't work in a format of plentiful and cheap removal, right? That's just like werewolves get dunked on because there's so much good cheap removal. But this also applies to the big things in the Esper colors, right? Like Morkrut Behemoth, there's a few other just like big fatties that some people I see on the battlefield sometimes. And you really have to be worried about that because this is kind of like constructed in a way where when there is a lot of cheap removal, you really get punished if you just tap out for a 5-drop and your opponent like revenges it, or they cast Infernal Grasp, or Olivia's Midnight Ambush, right? You're at such a mana disadvantage. And so anything that costs 4 or 5, any creature, or 6, 7 forbid, has to generate value for me to want to put it in my deck. It can't just be a thing that comes down and is big. That's just a recipe for getting blown out tempo-wise and value-wise, right? So like, Organ Hoarder is great, obviously, because it comes down, if they kill it, no big deal, right? You've got your value. There's a few 5 mana cards that do the same thing where they pseudo-draw a card. There's cards with Disturb that are more expensive that come down. You're okay if they kill you, right? Or they kill the creature, right? So I haven't put a Morkrut Behemoth in my deck since day one because, like I said, big things die, small things die too. But that's okay because you're not down a ton of mana. If they trade their 3 mana removal spell for your 2 or 3 drop, that's an okay exchange, right? Not so much of an okay exchange if they trade their 3 mana removal spell for your 5 drop. There is a such thing as too much removal in this format. This is something I've been saying a lot on my stream, but I'm generally aiming for like 4, 5 removal spells in my decks, because you just don't want to be trying to play a game where you remove all of their things and then the dust settles and you eventually win. That just doesn't really work in this format because there's so many value creatures. There's Organ Hoarders, there's Disturbed creatures, there's stuff like Falcon Abomination that comes down, makes a zombie, which is like, incremental value. So if you're just like, okay, kill that to all their value creatures, you're just gonna fall so far behind. Like you're just gonna lose that game. So I want a few good interaction spells to, just to be able to interact with important stuff, or be able to like turn the corner when I've established a board. But that can't be your plan. It just doesn't line up with the threats in the format. And so because of that, I've devalued removal spells in my pick orders. Like I often just don't take the black common removal spells very early. Like I said before, partially because people like them a little more than I do, and I think black gets a little bit overdrafted these days, but also because there's a lot of them, and I don't need to prioritize them because there are a lot of them, and I don't want that many of them, generally. So, yeah, just quality creatures are... This is a big thing I say generally for any format, but quality creatures, take those above removal spells most times. Another big picture thing is that curves start really early in this format, so you really need to lower your curve if you can. There's a lot of really good 1-drops, and there's a lot of pretty good 2 and 3 drops. You've got a Static Awakener, Lunarch Veteran, Death Bonnet Sprout, which that's an uncommon to be fair, but there's a lot of, you can go through the list of 1-drops in the set, and all of them are actively good, or the majority of them anyways. There's maybe like 1 or 2 stinkers in there. And so, I'm sure you've experienced this, where your opponent's gone turn 1 to Static Awakener, and you're like, oh crap, my first play is a 3-drop, right? I'm just dead, And so, like, I'm really focusing on my curve in this format, and my bar for an expensive card is pretty high. It has to be, just like I said, something that generates value, something that stabilizes the board. My best decks, some of my best decks, just have like, 5, 6 1-drops in them. The good ones, mind you. I'm not just gonna put the Snarling Wolf or whatever that card is called, the 1-mana green one that pumps. That card's pretty medium. But Lunarch Veteran is fantastic. I'm gonna play as many as I can get. A Static Awakener, same deal. A Static Awakener is a card I do want to talk about because I think it's still a little bit underrated in the sense that I think people are like, oh, this is like a zombies card, kind of, right? Like, you sacrifice your zombies and, you get value out of that, but it's just like an every deck card. I'm happy about this in basically every deck. Like, obviously it's good with fodder, but that fodder doesn't have to be zombies. It can just be like stuff like Novice Occultist, like the 1/2 that dies and you draw a card. Or sometimes you just like sack a smaller creature and you draw a card and add stats to your board. You sack like a 1/2 or like a 1/1, you sack something, you've added 2/2 worth of stats and drawn a card if you sack it, right? So that's not the worst deal either. So yeah, two big points here. Take a Static Awakener higher. I believe it is the best black common over Diaraph Horde, and draft 1-drops, lower your curve. Next up, I want to talk about the fact that there is not many reasons to play raw card draw in this format. This is another thing I've been saying a lot. You've probably heard this from, I think LSV has also been saying this, but there are so many value creatures in the set that you don't want to be playing stuff like Mysterious Tome, Curse of Surveillance, even Vivisection. It's just like all this tempo negative card draw. This is a really tempo positive format's not the right way to put it, but it's a format where tempo really matters. And like I was just saying, the curves start at 1, right? So anytime that you're spending not affecting the board really hurts you. And there's just like not that big a reason to put raw card draw that doesn't affect the board in this set when there's so many creatures that do affect the board and give you card draw. So like Tome is like, close to an F level playable, I would say. So like, maybe not F, that's a little harsh, but like a D. I am really hoping not to play that card. Same with Vivisection, Curse of Surveillance, all these cards, right? This is something that I've been saying, for the past few weeks, and I just like haven't found a reason to put raw card draw in my deck. Essentially, like I can imagine a deck where you've got a lot of really cheap removal, and you like are able to control the board early, and then your way to win the game is something like Curse of Surveillance or Mysterious Tome. But I just find that when I'm in that kind of space, the good value creatures are coming to me often enough that I still don't have to play these cards, essentially, right? So I'm not saying they're completely unplayable. I'm just saying I found a lot of success by not putting these cards in my deck, and I found that I am able to punish my opponents who play these cards more often than not, essentially. Okay, let's move to my archetype tiers, just some breakdowns. Back to archetypes. So the tier 1, like we said before, is blue-black, blue-white. I think that these are the best decks, not really close to the next tier of decks. The next tier of decks is blue-green, white-green, black, whites, and kind of some contentious ones down here, but I've got white, red, and blue red here. So don't need to talk too much about the top decks, but I do want to talk about this middle tier. We'll talk about tier 3 in a second. But green-white, I just like as a deck, like often a heavy white deck, like just like a low to the ground white weenie deck, splashing some of the green cards. I often aren't like, I don't have that many green cards, like I was saying before. I don't think they provide all that much, most of them anyways, but the good green cards do, the uncommons, and especially the golden uncommons, they really help. Any bombs you pick up. Green-blue is a deck I really like. We're going to get to talking about all these decks a little bit more in depth in a second, so I won't take too long. I do want to talk about the red decks here, Sunrise, red-blue, and red-white here. I think a big thing, this is what Ryan was telling me, Ryan Sachs, I was talking to him. He wrote a whole article about this, you can check that out on Star City. He did a really, really good breakdown of blue-red. But one of the things that he said that he thinks blue-red is underperforming, or one of the reasons he thinks it's underperforming, is he thinks that people are misbuilding the deck pretty substantially. And the way he backed up this claim is if you go to 17 lands and you look at the most played cards in red-blue decks, a lot of them are cards that you don't don't perform well in red-blue, right? The example that he gives is Ardent Elementalist, right? It's the 4-mana 2/1 buys back an instant or sorcery. You'd think that card would be really good in red-blue, but red-blue often wants to play like this base red tempo game, where you're like got the Festival Crashers and you play Crasher early, and then you kind of just keep up mana every other turn of the game, where you're reacting to your opponent, and then you're turning the corner quickly with your Crashers and your Therma Alchemists and stuff, right? And because you want to leave up mana every turn to play, hold up instants, hold up counter spells, whatever, something like Ardent Elementalist is just not a great card because you're tapping out on turn 4 to buy back a spell. And so, I've had experience with blue-red at this point. It took me a while to draft the deck, but I do think it's pretty good. It has felt good to me, and the 52% aggregate win rate of the deck amongst 17 lands users surprises me, I guess is the way I would put it. Maybe it's the fact that people are playing blue cards and red cards that don't mesh well together. That can sometimes happen. They're just in general, they're putting the wrong cards in the deck in their decks. But I think that this is a deck that I'm pretty happy to get into. It does require some know-how to build a deck correctly. We're not going to be doing a deep dive on blue-red today. I'll give maybe a few thoughts. But that is, I wouldn't be afraid to go into blue-red if I opened a red bomb, or I opened a blue bomb, or first picked a good red-blue card, and red cards were coming to me, essentially. And then red-white is in a similar space, where I've drafted a lot of red-white decks lately, where I just have all the 1-drops in the world, and the red uncommons, the red-white uncommons, the gold ones, the Sunrise Cavalier, the 3/3 haste trample that gets counters, and you can put counters when day turns to night or night turns to day. And Sacred Fire, it's the 2-mana deal 2, you gain 2 with flashback. Those are great cards, truly fantastic cards. I think this is the, I don't think that the red cards complement the white cards all that well, funny enough. They do the job of our aggressive things, but red kind of plays this burn game, and white kind of plays this grow my creatures game, which there's some crossover, but I found there's a bit of tension in the ways you want to sequence your spells. But I do think what red-white does well is makes use of these 2 great gold cards, and that's just a big pull into red-white to me, because these are fantastic cards. They perform really, really well in the deck if you look at 17 lands. These are the top 2 uncommons in the deck. So red-white's a deck I'm pretty happy to be in, now, especially now that red is opening up a little bit. Tier 3. Let's go to tier 3 quickly. So I think that vampires and werewolves and green-black are my tier 3 decks. Vampires is a weird one, because I can see it moving to tier 2 depending on how you want to classify it. Because I think that good red-black decks are not truly vampire decks. They're just black decks with some red cards, essentially. Because the vampire synergies are pretty bad when it comes down to it. The enablers for getting in damage, aside from Vampire Stinger, or whatever the 1-drop red card's called, that card's good. But the 2-drops, Vampire Interloper, and the 2/1 that attacks and deals 1 are just not good aggressive cards, in my opinion. They just underperform at their job. Vampire Interloper tends to get blocked by all the flying creatures in the format, and just gets remove. It can get removed because there's a lot of removal in the format. That's not a great point against it, but I do take umbrage with the fact that it's an aggressive creature that literally never blocks. I think that is a downside that people don't appreciate enough. And then like 2/1 never gets in. It triggers your life loss stuff. But the point I want to get at here is that the life loss stuff, you know, the things that trigger off of when you've dealt damage are generally unimpressive, right? I think that they're kind of just like, okay, cool, you did the thing. Now I just untap and kill your creature a lot of the time, right? They can have some aggressive starts. You can definitely get like the nutty start where they go like Vampire Socialite, which is the golden common, into stuff and you just get steamrolled. That can certainly happen. I just don't think it happens that often. And the cost for putting stuff like Vampire Interloper and the red 2-drop Vampire in your deck is pretty high for a not great payoff. The successful red-black decks I've had are just like, and this is where I think a lot of the people are having success with red-black, are twofold. There's two categories here. It's like base black decks that just have good black cards and you're supplementing it with red cards. So it just kind of like plays out like attrition-y black game that black decks play in this format. Or like you are spells based. You're like Crashers and the Stingers, and you just happen to pick up some black cards. In both versions of those decks, I actually like Vampire Socialite. This is the red-black 2/2 menace uncommon that I was talking about. Just as like a fine creature that kind of provides you incidental value at times. Like, this is fine. I just don't think you want to go in for the vampire stuff, essentially. Red-green, we've talked about this a lot, why it's bad. The commons in both red and green are, you know, lesser than the other color pairs, and their shtick of land a big creature and hope that attacks you a bunch is not very good in this format. And then black-green. Black-green's an interesting one because it's also a deck that is winning more than I would expect it to, based on intuition and how the cards line up and just like lack of synergy. So I think what happens is a lot of times is that there aren't a lot of synergies to go for in green-black. And so a lot of times what happens is people wind up in green-black, not because, oh cool, look, these synergies work where I'm like doing Death Matters morbid things. It's just like, I opened a green bomb and black was open. Right, I have a Huntmaster, you know, Tovolar's Huntmaster, and black was open, so I have like some really good cards, and I paired them with my good black cards, right? So I would assume that the reason is that green-black is winning a little bit more than I would have expected is just that people only find themselves in it when they have good cards, essentially, right? And it doesn't get played otherwise because there's not a lot of reason to play. I think it can, like, you could maybe say it plays like a grindy game if you get the exact right cards, but I just think that, like, if you're drafting black, you might as well pair black with basically any other color pair, any other color, and you'll probably end up with a better deck with more intrinsic, implicit synergies than green-black. So just a few more thoughts about the decks as we go on here. Blue-black zombies, I don't want to talk about it too much because you can listen anywhere about this deck, really. You know, limited resources in a deep dive, Sandblack's in a deep dive. I just want to say that I don't think your baseline should be blue-black's always going to be open, like it might have been a week ago or two. It's just not anymore. People know the secret's up, secret's out, but you're going to find yourself in pods where it is sometimes, right? One of the things that people often say is, oh, have you found blue-black? Is, you know, I found that blue-black's contested in my pods, and somebody else will say, oh, I found blue-black still really open in my pods. And that's just like, that's just by nature of how large the arena population is. Sometimes you get put into a pod where people know what's up. Sometimes you get put into a pod where people don't know what's up, right? And you're just gonna get a sicko blue-black deck, right? So, I mean, still a great deck. The strength of the deck has not diminished by any means. I just think that you shouldn't expect to be in blue-black all the time when you first pick a good blue card and a good black card. I don't think you should be forcing it, but just be on the lookout for the pods where they let you just have all the goodies, you know. Blue-white quickly. I do want to talk about this deck because it hasn't gotten as much press as black-blue. I think Sam Black has done an episode on it, which is a really good episode. Well, I know he has. I've heard it. It's a really good episode, just going into the ins and outs of it. But just a few thoughts on blue-white, as I think the most important card for blue-white is Lunarch Veteran. It just does so many things for the deck. It's like the 1-mana 1/1 that gains life and has Disturbed. It just makes it so that it does a few things like good against blue-black, the other best deck in the format. Because like if you have a Veteran on 1, or if you're really lucky, a Veteran on 1 and 2, blue-black isn't able to do the tempo you outgame plan that it likes to do sometimes. Like blue-black is such a good deck because it can play both ends of the spectrum, a tempo game and a grindy game. And if you just start with a Veteran, there's not a lot of decks in the format, if you're playing creatures, and these decks tend to have really high creature counts, that can tempo you out, right? Just by virtue of you're just going to be up like 10 life over the course of the game, and that includes blue-black. And what blue-black does well, if it can't tempo you out, is it grinds you out. But blue-white also grinds you out pretty well because all of its creatures are 2-for-1s, and arguably better than blue-black a lot of the time, because like you're trading on board, and especially if you have things that mill, you're getting a card advantage in a way that blue-black doesn't have access to. It kind of has like incremental card advantage, blue-black does, and like blue-white kind of has, okay, well, like my Covetous Castaway dies, I mill 3, I draw 2 creatures. It's just like up so many rock cards over blue-black, and that's an advantage over blue-black, because blue-black doesn't take advantage of self-mill very well. There's no black disturb cards, or there's very few, and they're not good ones. And the blue disturb cards, there's a few good ones, but the white ones are the ones that fill out your deck most often. So that's an advantage that blue-white has over blue-black, and like I said, I think it has a pretty good matchup. So that's this Lunarch Veteran in a vacuum. I think that the card is fantastic, both because it lets you not get tempoed out, and you get free value from it when you mill it from your grave. It's an uphill battle. When your opponent plays turn 1 Lunarch Veteran, it's a real uphill battle. I'm sure you face this card. I don't need to talk about it too much longer. I just want to point out that I would play as many Lunarch Veterans as I can in blue-white. Green-white. So, on screen here, I know for audio people, you can't see this, but I have a green-white deck that I think is like the typical green-white deck I end up in, where it's like heavy white. It's like this white melee-based beatdown deck, splashing some green cards, right? Like Join the Dance. I've got Catilda here as the green-white rare. I've got Contortionist Troop. The green cards supplement the white cards really well, but I think you just want to build your green-white decks as like base white weenie decks, because the other good green cards don't provide all that much. Like a lot of the good green commons are like grindier cards. Like you've got Eccentric Farmer, you've got Shadow Beast Sighting, which are fine. You can play them in the deck, but they're not really pulls. And I think just like sticking to like base white with like Gavany Trappers and Candlegrove Witches and Search Party Captains, Gavany Silversmith, really good, just white based. I'm happy with. So I would just say, I'm not going to go into too much depth on any deck here, but I would just say that like when you're building your green-white decks or when you're drafting them, try to bias towards white. Blue-green tempo. So blue-green is a deck that I think a lot of people are looking at as like grindy blue-green flashback, loop my deck, mill myself a bunch, kill you with infinite value. Eventually kind of deck. Like we've seen those kind of decks in the past in different formats, and I think the best versions of blue-green aren't quite that. I think you can have good versions of that deck where you're splashing a bit. Totally, I've had good versions of that kind of deck, but I think the more common version of the deck is just like blue-green tempo, where you've got like Baithook Anglers that just like attack well on turn 2 flyer, and the Harvesttide Sentries, the 3-1s that gain Coven. In blue-green in particular, you actually get Coven really easily because the 3-1 is 3 is a pretty rare power. Then you have like Lure Zombies, you have the backside of Baithook Angler, and then 2/2s are always the most present. So like if you always have 3 with you have Sentry, and this is like the Coven card that you care about most in this deck, and this like play a tempo based 2-drop, you always have 3. 1's pretty easy to come by, and 2's trivial. I think that you can just like this might be the best Harvesttide Sentry deck. Even better than green-white a lot of the times. So like you got these good 2-drops, you got Root Coil Creepers, like a good thing that can like help you get a tempo advantage. And then the card I really want to talk about is Winterthorn Blessing. So this is the uncommon, the gold one that puts a counter on something, taps something down, and has flashback. Such a beating. Just like if you go 1-drop, 2-drop, or even 2-drop, 3-drop, Winterthorn getcha. Like it's really hard for most opponents to come back from that. And of course, this is just like a really good deck for Revenge of the Drowned. Play that tempo game really well. Just like top your thing, time walk you, make a resource. Often your 2/2 zombie in this deck is more used to like deal 2 to the face rather than used for some sort of tapping ability or sacrificing. But that's just as good. The other thing about blue-green is you also kind of get this intrinsic card advantage because look, Organ Hoarder and Eccentric Farmer are still good cards in this deck. I'm not going to not play them, and because you get to play the good blue disturb cards, and you get to play like whatever decent flashback cards in blue-green there are, and there's a few of them in there. Winterthorn Blessing being one of them. You also get to keep up on card advantage like you would in white-green. In white-blue, right? Because you get this incidental value in your graveyard. So like you're kind of doing what blue-white's doing well in the format, where it's like playing this tempo game, but also grinds pretty well. Just quickly, I think you can build this as more ramp, not really ramp, but like splish splashy, where you're prioritizing like jack-o'-lanterns to when you're self-milling, and not so much the 2/4, the Dawn Heart card that gains you life and adds mana. I think that card's a little bit too clunky. But on 17 lands, one of the really interesting stats is that the top common in blue-green, and aggregate, right, where who knows how people are building their blue-green decks. I actually think people are building them mostly like grindy. But the top comment is Defenestrate, which is just like hilarious, right? Which makes sense because like you get a hard removal spell to like supplement your like grindy plan. Sometimes you just do have to kill a thing. Really kind of funny. I don't think you want to be splashing Defenestrate in like tempo versions, but in your like slower versions, it's been something I've done. Black-white quickly. Not a lot to talk about this deck. It's pretty straightforward. Where I think, the synergies, the small synergies are there, where you've got like Flesh Taker, sacrificing stuff, you've got Eccentric Awakener, which is a fantastic card. I think more than the other Esper decks, blue-white and blue-black, black-white is just like good cards. There's definitely some edges to be gained with like, small synergies in there, but I'm just trying to play as many Ecstatic Awakeners and Lunatic Veterans and like Diagraph Hordes as I can, essentially. I don't think my black-white decks, the good ones, have just been mostly good cards. I think that it's fairly synergy light relative to the rest of the format, but it's a good deck. I'm happy to be in it. Blue-red. This is a good example of a good blue-red deck. Again, I know I'm going to try to describe this for people that are listening audio only, but we've got 3 Festival Crashers, the 1/3 that gets bigger when you play a spell. We've got 2 Neonates Rush, we've got 2 Revenge of the Drowned, we've got a Burn Down the House, which, like I said, is a reason to go into red when you open a bomb, and this is what happened in this draft. I opened Burn Down the House, and I got past good red and blue cards, and I think that, I've talked about this deck a little bit, I don't want to talk about it too much, but just keep this on your radar as a deck that I'm happy to build. I would say that if you're unsure how to build the deck, maybe be less willing to go into it, right? Like, if you jump into a draft right after this podcast, maybe don't, right? Because there are some traps you can fall into if you're not sure the ins and outs of the decks. Like I said, I would recommend Ryan's article. It's on Star City. I think it's on the free side. He does a really good job of explaining it. We don't have time to go through it here. And, but yeah, I've really been impressed after I kind of have come around to drafting the red decks. Red-white aggro. So red-white, I think, is best as just like playing all the 1-drops, Voldaren Stingers, you got Chaplain Malms at uncommon, you've got Gavony Trapper, which is a good card. I think it's an underrated card too, based on where I see it. And then just like, one of the tensions, like I was saying before, is that like, you can kind of get torn between the red burn plan and the white grow my creatures attack each turn plan. And they're not so like divorced from each other that they cause massive fissure within the deck, but I do think, just like any good aggro deck, you want to lean towards one color. Both because it makes your mana better. This is actually a pretty bad version because I'm really split, but both because it makes your mana better, being like base one color, especially if you're trying to play 16 lands, you don't really want to be like split playing only 8 sources of each, but also because they do slightly different things. The colors do slightly different things, right? Moving on, vampires. Like I was saying, this is like a good version of just like grindy. I've got just good black cards, good red cards. Again, I was drawn into this deck because I have Burn Down the House. I opened Gisa in pack 2 and got past the other Gisa, which was kind of nice. But this is what your typical good black-red deck looks like, I think. Not heavy on the vampire synergies, just like a little bit grindy. Could be a little bit spell-based, where you're like leaning into that red spells package I was talking about, that like with the red commons, but not leaning into vampires too much, because I think that's mostly trap synergies essentially. Green black, we talked about that. Mostly just good cards. And then the last archetype we have here is red green. I got tricked into drafting red green because I opened Arlen. I think that's what happens a lot of the time, right? Like often when my opponent goes, in Mythic or Diamond goes Mountain Forest, I'm like, all right, they've got Arlen, or they've got like Tovolar, and I think that opening Arlen is actually an okay reason to move into green-red. You just have to be a little bit careful. I think Tovolar, who's the Werewolf Lord, who like pays you off for having werewolves in your deck, I think that is not a good reason, because he asks you to put other werewolves in your deck, where Arlen doesn't ask you to put other werewolves in your deck. It's just a good card, right? So where you can first pick Arlen, you can maybe even splash it in some decks if that happens. I would say that splashing is pretty bad in this format as a general note. That might have been a good thing to talk about for in the big picture stuff, but I think splashing is really hard unless you pick up multiple jack-o'-lanterns, and it's just like, because this format is so tempo based and you don't have a lot of time to just do whatever, I think you don't want to putz around with your mana, so you want to make sure you have like a really solid splash foundation. And I think that more often than not is incorrect to splash, so just be very careful. So you could splash Arlen, but that's something I'm not looking to do that often. With Arlen, let's say you open Arlen, right? You first pick it and you're like, okay, I'm gonna say to myself, I'm gonna draft red green. Let's just do it. I've had enough of blue black. What I think you want to do is either lean into that red common core, where you're just like the spell based stuff, where you've got the crashers, the vampire stingers, and then like just slightly touching red, or you can be like a heavy green deck with a little bit of red. I don't like that as much, just because, like I said, I think a heavy green deck is generally a recipe for failure in this format. One of the things I've seen is like red-green spells. It's kind of this offshoot of blue-red spells, where you're like, heavy red, you play Shadow Beast Sighting as a creature spell, which is kind of cool. It's the 4/4 token maker. And then like you pick up the just like, you know, incidental green cards too. So that's a space you can be if you do find yourself in green-red, and like, you know, you end up in a space where you do want to draft green-red, and you're like, okay, I'm willing to accept that this could go terribly wrong. Just quickly from chat, I just want to answer a question. There's a few questions about splashing, and people are saying, oh, I've had some good experiences, and also like, what happens if you pick up a few Evolving Wilds? But if you've had good experiences, by all means, like I don't want to discount your experiences at all. I've just found that it is more often than not like net positive bad to splash, just because of the time you take off, you know, either playing tap lands or cracking jack-o'-lanterns, or you know, playing Dawn, I really need to know the name of this card, the 4 mana 2/4 that taps to add mana and gain 3, right? It is there's not a lot of painless fixing. It often comes at a cost, right? We're not like an AFR or Strixhaven where the fixing was fairly painless because you made treasures or you had environmental sciences. It's often a deck building and gameplay cost. So I'm not saying you can't splash at all. I'm just saying you shouldn't be very willing to, right? Like a lot of times I'm going through my drafts and Twitch is like, oh, do you want to splash that card? Like that's like a decent splash card, right? And I'm like, generally no. Generally no is my answer. But I never want to discount somebody who has opposite opinions or opposite experiences, because, you know, you might have a setup that actually does work. All right, draft navigation. We're in the home stretch here, chat. So, like I said, this is something that I want to, I just want to talk about how I'm navigating my drafts. I think it's really important to just have a general strategy for navigating drafts in general, in any format. Kind of a roadmap to the draft, if you will. Because I think too often, people just kind of just jump in and let the draft take them for a ride without having a plan. Really, you know, it's good to have a plan as you're drafting. It's good to have a plan in your gameplay, but I think it helps to have a plan as you jump into the draft. So the common draft navigation paths I find are, I start with a good red card, I start with a good black card, I start with a good white card, or I start with a good blue card. I keep taking cards of those colors because there's a lot of them, of all three of these colors, and then I kind of just figure it out after. So generally it's like, I first pick a great blue card, and I keep taking blue cards, I get really deep into blue, and then my secondary color, I'll just figure it out after. I want to bias towards the better decks, of course. If I can, you know, take a black card, I will do that. I can take a white card if I first pick blue cards. Sure, I'll do that. I want to get into the best decks. My big thing I want to point out here is twofold. I am still, even though I like red more these days, I am still trying my best to start in black, white, or blue, because those are just more powerful colors. And I think what you really want to do at this point in the format is, I think we're not in the you just get away with forcing stage of the format anymore. There's too much information out there where if you go in being like, oh yeah, blue black's the best deck, or blue white's the best deck, and you just try to go in with that, I think that is a recipe for a train wreck. Because if you just go like white card, blue card, white card, blue card, and like one or both of those colors aren't open, you can kind of end up with some real not great decks. So what I think you really want to do is first pick your card of whatever color it is, go down that path and just keep taking cards of that color. Stay monocolored as long as you can, and then just pair it with the most open color. Because there's some really good bombs in this set. There's some really good uncommons in the set. You might get past them, right? And I think that's a recipe for both playing really good cards and not getting train wrecked. Because you just like, I basically put a lot of value on staying one color, because that is, that flexibility in a format that's kind of in flux, where people now have information of the best decks, and in a format where, I think these 3 colors are deep enough that I feel confident just taking cards of those colors and I'll get more of them later. That makes me want to just go stay one color as long as possible, figure it out later what my second color is, essentially. But if I don't start my draft with one of those colors, right, with one of the better colors, I do start my draft with a red card or with a green card. I open up Moonveil Region or Consuming Blob, right? That makes me say, okay, well, if I start with a red card, just to kind of reiterate what I've been saying to put a button on it, that probably means I want to stay as base red as possible, because I think the red cards play better with each other than they do with other colors. So like, take the red card, keep taking red cards. It's kind of the same as the other path, right? I figure it out later. But if I first pick a green card, I think what I want to do is first pick a green card, like Consuming Blob, and then get into another color, essentially. So like, put that blob in, it's definitely a bias towards green, and I'll take a good green card if I can the next pick. But more than any other color, I'm more willing to first, like, then pick a blue card, or then pick a black card, or maybe not black card because it's green-black, right? Then pick a white card, because I think that heavy green decks don't perform as well as green paired with heavy something else, right? Heavy white, heavy black, heavy red. I think that's my big picture take on the format. And just as far as draft navigation goes, chat, one thing I want to say as well is that I still think that the Esper decks are some of the best decks, and that's not going to change. Nothing in the data, I believe, will change if you're looking at like how decks are performing. I don't believe that there's going to be massive shifts where suddenly, red, blue, once people start to figure out how to build it, will become a top deck. You're not going to see many shifts in the data. We just have a large enough sample size that it's just kind of like, this is how the format is. As far as like raw power of how good the deck is. But what will change is the availability of the good decks at each table. And you need to put new tools in your toolbox going forward, right? You need to know how to draft the red decks. You need to know how to draft the green deck, because there's going to be some tables where you have 7 people in the know, quote unquote, and they're all fighting over the Esper cards, and you don't want to train wreck that draft, right? So yes, maybe you end up with in the abstract, your red deck is worse than a blue-red or a blue-black deck you face. But in your given draft, it is correct to draft red, because that's just what the table demands, right? And I think you do really, I would really suggest trying to add that tool to your toolbox, learning how to draft those decks. And, the great resources are out there. I'm usually not one for deep dives on decks, but Sam Black always does great deep dives. I'm sure Lords Unlimited and Unlimited Resources are going to do a few in the future. And of course, you can always just like check out a Discord, check out a stream. There's going to be people, if you're a little bit lost, is like how to build these decks correctly. Individual cards. Let's talk about a few as we close it out here. I want to talk about Ritual of Hope. So this is a card, another one that is the data surprises me for this card. This is the 1 white instant creatures you control get +1/+1 until on a turn. Coven, they get +2/+1. This card's been really, really impressive for me. The data shows it is a, relative to the other white cards, an underperformer. And I think, you should be careful about, I've been saying it a lot during this episode, but I think you should be careful about not, about saying, oh, like people are building their deck wrong, and that's why this card is bad. I think a lot of the time the data does point towards the good cards and the bad cards, and like there are exceptions to that by for sure. But I guess my thing I want to point out here is that I think more times than not, the data is just correct about a card rather than something weird is happening and the data shows a higher or lower win rate than you would expect, right? But I do want to point this card out as I think one that, at least in my intuition and based on the decks I've been putting it in, it's a really, really powerful effect where in decks that go wide, you know, they've got the Clarion Cathars, the 4-mana 3/3 plus the 1/1. You've got just like other things that go wide, the Dawnhart Mentor, maybe Join the Dance. This is like a turn 5 win card a lot of the time. And the time is not, it's just like a, you know, a combat trick that you can maybe line up to like eat a creature, eat 2 sometimes, right? So with all that caveat that I just said about trusting the data and not like trying to like explain the data too much, I do wonder if this is a card that people are putting in their decks that don't get Coven that easily, or just like have a hard time getting Coven, or decks that aren't going wide. Because if you're not going wide, this card isn't that good. They usually are able to make decent blocks where it's like, okay, I don't die, you traded your whole board away here, now we're back to square one. I really want this card to be like, I have a very large board and you just die when I cast it, right? I also think that like too often people build their decks assuming they're going to have Coven, and I kind of made this assumption early on where I was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna have Coven. But a lot of decks, I'm like, oh, I just like don't have Coven very often. Like a lot of my blue-white decks, I have just like infinite 2/2s, you know? So really be careful about how often you can get Coven or how comfortably you can get it and how wide you're going. If those two things happen, I think this card is very good. But I just be careful about, you know, the decks you put this in. Delver of Secrets is one that I want to talk about, where this is a card that, again, the data kind of alerted me to maybe this card is better than we thought. This is, you know, classically, this is a card where it's like, oh, don't put Delver in your limited decks. It doesn't do the thing you want to do, right? But I think that in a deck with enough spells, and enough spells is like minimum 12 or 11, this is a good turn 1 play, in the sense that tempo positive plays in this format are so important. And if this is just a 1/1 that at some point turns into a 3/2, like you can reasonably turn into a 3/2 over the course of the next 4 turns, it's pretty darn good, right? So like if you just like magically, you know, you've invested 1 mana and then on turn 4 you get a 3/2, you're like, okay, I'm pretty happy with that deal. 3/2 flyer, that is. It's not like Constructed where you need to turbo it out for it to be a good card. I'm just happy that I get a 3/2 at some point that I've invested 1 mana into, right? And then you also have the nut draws of play Delver on 1, it flips on 2, your opponent's under a ton of pressure, right? So I would be careful about the decks I put Delver in, but if you're confident that you have a good Delver deck, I wouldn't be shy about putting it in my deck, and I've had good experiences. And just a note about the data, just quickly, this is a card that I put in my deck because the data implied it might be better than I was giving it credit for, and then I kind of came to that conclusion after I played it, where it's like, oh, I understand, it's not doing the role of flip on 2, kill you quickly, it's playing the role of play on 1, be a very tempo positive play, and then just go from there, essentially. Sunset Revelry is a really interesting card. So this is 1 and a white for a sorcery. If an opponent has more life than you, you gain 4. If an opponent has more creatures than you, you make 2 1/1s. If they have more cards in hand than you, they draw a card. I found this card's just good, actually. It's you know, it's cuttable. It's not like a slam dunk place in all my decks, but I found it's not hard to engineer a situation where you get 2 out of the 3 modes. If you get 2 out of the 3 modes, you're pretty happy, right? You make 2 1/1s, you gain 4 life. Great. You make 2 1s, you draw a card. That's fantastic as well. The fail case of slightly better revitalize, I guess that's not the true fail case. Sometimes it does do stone nothing, but most times I haven't found that to be the case. But the worst mode of draw a card, gain 4 life is not the end of the world, and the times you get all 3, it's a fantastic card, right? So this is a card I'm really looking to play. It's really tricky because there's not like, I don't think there's particularly decks this is better in than others. It's kind of just more like there's game states that are this is better than others, and you can't always predict that game state. I would say the more Lunarch veterans you have, or just like, yeah, I guess the Lunarch veteran is a pretty good example, but in blue-white in general, I don't think it's a great card because you often have a really wide board, and you often have a lot of life because you have Lunarch veterans. So I think this is more of like a black-white card or a green-white card. The more Lunarch veterans I have, the less likely I'm going to play this, because that's both like a source of life gain and an early creature, so you're just going to be ahead on the creature count, most likely. So, yeah, just be on the lookout. It's not a stone unplayable, essentially. Gavany Trapper is one I want to talk about, where this card is taken very lowly, and when I do deck text, this card's in the sideboard a lot. This card's good. Like, this card's just a good card. I think we've been, people have been scared off by the past years of tappers not being good. You know, we've seen like the one from Ikoria, which is 2 mana to get on the battlefield and 2 mana to tap. But this is just, like, the 1 mana tappers with the 2 mana tap ability are just a good class of cards, I think. I would play 2 of them, 3 of them. I don't find they get bad in multiples, especially in my blue-white decks that want to go long, where they, like, in the late game, I'm okay putting sinking mana into it and just, like, closing the game out. In my white-green decks, where this is, like, a really good Covenant enabler, plus a good aggressive tool, where it's like, okay, you know, they have trouble racing you because they can't attack with their biggest thing, because they attack with their biggest thing, you tap down their other thing, you get in for a big swing. So I would just take this card highly and put it in your deck higher as well. I think that if I look in I looked at the average last seen and the average taken at data for this card, it's taken pretty lowly. It's taken under some real stinkers. Like, people are taking some real bad cards over this card, even in white. So yeah, this is a card I like. Hobbling Zombie is the opposite of this, where this is a card that people are taking really, really highly, apparently. This is like one of the top draft commons, and I think it's just fine. Like, it's a 23rd playable in my black deck sometimes. Like, the rate on 2/2 Death Touch makes a decay token on death is not particularly exciting. I often just have better 3-drops to play. I want to point this card out because often when I'm streaming, people point this card out as like, oh, you don't like this card? Like, it's like pick 4, pick 5, like no consideration for Hobbling Zombie, and it's like, not really. So like, I think this is fine. I just don't think it's a card that you need to prioritize, because I think it's just like filler level essentially. And Larder Zombie, you know, I think this one's getting a lot of press, but I just want to you know, bring forth the good word of Larder Zombie, as I'm happy with a copy of this in literally all of my blue decks. Just the fact that you play this on 1 and you don't flood in the mid game, you bin your disturbed creatures in the mid game, you're drawing cards. It's a good speed bump for the decay tokens. Sometimes I'll even play 2. It's not that bad to have play 2, because like, yeah, the effect is dead on the second one, but often if you draw your second one, you don't mind putting that into combat for like a double block and trading off or whatever. And so it's not a 0 essentially. So yeah, I mean, I was watching Sandra Black draft the other night, and he was like, am I gonna second pick a Larder Zombie? I think I will. And like, yeah, like, it was a bad pack, but I wouldn't feel like terrible about doing so. So play more Larder Zombie. The very last card we have here, Jack-o'-lantern. So Max Mick on Twitter, who is, you know, GP has done really well in GP limited GPs in the past. I think he did a brief stint working at Wizard. A really good limited player that often drafts wacky decks. And so he's been posting, his words not mine, just like decks with abhorrent mana bases that are getting there off the back of Jack-o'-lantern. Because this is kind of an exploitable point in the format where this card basically always wheels. And I played a deck earlier today that was like, it was a really tough draft, and I was kind of scraping for playables, and I was like base blue-green, splashing like 5 black cards off of 4 Jack-o'-lanterns, and it was actually pretty good. I think that if you have self-mill, and this is kind of like, you don't have to pay a mana to get this into the grave, it's just kind of like this thing that gets this into the grave somehow, and you just filter your mana, really nice. So I would say that, I was talking about how fixing and like splashing is pretty tough in this format. The least intrusive way to splash in this format is Jack-o'-lantern plus self-mill, I would say. So if you have like 3 Jack-o'-lanterns plus some self-mill, the mana just kind of fixes itself. So this is a card that, if your draft is going a little bit off the rails, or you have a good bomb that is splashable, and like maybe, you know, you're not trending towards being able to play it, you're trending away from that, pick up the Jack-o'-lanterns and you might be able to play it. Alright, chat. That is it. Thank you so much, chat, for hanging out. As always, like I said at the top of the show, if you liked what we're doing here, check us out on Patreon. Really, really helps the show. Thank you so much to all the supporters every single week. Really, really appreciate it. I couldn't be doing this as much as I do if it weren't for you. And let's open up for a quick chat Q&A. Oh, I didn't, God, I didn't talk about Candle Trap. Oh man. You know what? Let's do a quick Candle Trap / locked in the cemetery talk. Yeah, let's do that quickly, because that's a really important point of the format as well. It's very simple. Don't play those cards. Don't play Candle Trap and Locked in the Cemetery. I'm not saying literally never play them, but your baseline should be, I don't want these cards in my deck. like there's just better interaction in the format, and the cost on Candle Trap and Locked in the Cemetery of being like an enchantment-based removal spell that can get punished in multiple ways, both because there's sacrifice stuff in the format that they can sacrifice their creature, and there's like incidental enchantment and artifact removal in like the Cathar Commando and that like 2-drop uncommon werewolf. There's like Dawn Griff to pick up your stuff. If you literally have no interaction, I think Candle Trap is an okay card. But I very, very, very rarely end up in the spot where I need to play Candle Trap. Like, if Candle Trap was just 4 mana, exile something, I would think that card would be just fine. It's like not an exciting removal spell compared to the other removal spells in this format, right? And it's not that a lot of the time. Sometimes you just don't have Coven, right? You're just gonna do a lot better off if you don't play them. And this is just like a bigger picture thing where I think your baseline moving forward for these kind of cards are you just like should assume that these cards are bad until proven otherwise. Just the way that sets are designed these days. Like, there's a lot of incidental enchantment removal. There's sacrifice effects that happen to make their way into sets. There are, there's just like a lot of things that tend to punish these type of cards. And we've seen it over and over and over again. And so, until proven otherwise, in a format, like, I'm going in with the assumption these cards are not very good. Chat says Candle Trap over Locked in the Cemetery. I agree with that. I'm still hoping not to play either. Oh, and the other thing too, chat, is what I would say is, you don't need that many interaction spells in the format. This is the other big thing, where I see people being like, they've got a Gavany Trapper, and like, maybe 2 Gavany Trappers, and like, one Olivia's Midnight Ambush, right? And then they also have a Candle Trap in their deck, and it's like, those 3 interaction spells are good enough for me. They're good enough that I don't feel like the need to put this not great card in my deck, essentially. Right? I don't need to stoop that low. You don't need that much interaction in this format. Like, you just need a few to like get you through, an important combat or kill that one important thing. In fact, like I was saying before, too much removal can actually hinder you in this format, just the way that the threats line up where there's a lot of value creatures. So like, I've seen a lot of concerns being like, I'm a little bit light on removal, and I look and the light on removal is like, you have 4 other interaction spells. So, yeah, I don't think you need to play it when you're in those situations too. Any words on Flip the Switch and the discard spells? That's No Way Out? Yeah. Flip the Switch is great. This is a format that's conducive to counter spells, both because there's a lot of ways to use your mana at instant speed, but also they are clean answers to stuff like Organ Hoarder, just like things that generate value on entry or death. But also just like intrinsically, Flip the Switch is a powerful card, where it's a counter spell plus a resource. I would take that card pretty highly. Like, if I first pick a good blue card, I'm not sad to second pick it, essentially. No Way Out, I don't like very much. I think it is filler minus. Like, it's okay. When I cast the card, I've not felt terrible about it, but I also don't think I usually need to stoop that low on the playable spectrum. Black is such a deep color. I'm usually pairing black with like blue or white, which is also really deep. I don't think it's a card I actively want, Yeah, so Jekyll, just to return to Candle Trap really quickly, Jekyll MTG is talking about places where Candle Trap might be good. If you are in a Disturb deck where you're just trying to like, you can get Coven easily, so the exile mode is turns on quickly. Because let me be clear, you still don't want it to be sitting around a lot. You want the exile mode to be on. But if you're in a deck that doesn't care that much about attacking on the ground early, that's the other point I didn't bring up even about Candle Trap, is that it's like when you're an aggressive white deck, you put it on their thing, and maybe a trade was gonna happen. You have a 3/3, you put it on their 3/3. Like, the fact that they get to gain 3 life by chump walking is that matters a lot too. So in a deck that is defensive, or you're like playing the early game to just like survive, it is passable, I think, if you're lacking interaction and you can turn on the Covenant ability. Is Sun Gold Barrage ever playable? Like the low to the ground aggro decks or something? No, I think Sun Gold Barrage is a card you should very much try to avoid putting in your deck. Like, there's some decks it's just stone dead against, and in a deck or against a deck that it has targets, you're going to be waiting around a long time to find a good target often. So like, the more aggressive my deck is, the more I don't want that card, because like aggressive decks can't afford to just have this card that sits around in their hand waiting for a target. If I'm a slower deck, like I'm blue-white, I could see myself playing that card, because the longer the game goes, the more the the more likely it is you'll find a target for it, and like the more you don't mind just sitting around like with this card in hand that you're not using. But that falls into the category of I would try not to play that card. Oh, that's a good question. What's up with Morning Patrol's win rate? It's pretty poor for being a blue-white spirit card, which is a good deck. I think what's up with Morning Patrol's win rate is that so if you look at its aggregate win rate, it's pretty poor. This is the 2/3 vigilance that turns into a 2/1 vigilance flyer. But if you filter by blue-white, it's pretty good. Like, this is one of the cards that you really, the game in hand aggregate win rate doesn't tell the full story. You really need to filter, because it does get a little bit better in blue-whites, just by nature of, like, you have sifters to discard it, you have other ways to mill it. I don't think it's a very good card in, like, white-red or green-white. It's, like, filler minus, essentially, like, just, like, a little bit too dorky. The value of that card comes from being a good blocker early and sometimes going to the graveyard. All right, chat, I'm off. Thank you so much once again. Everybody out there listening on the podcast feed or on YouTube, thank you. I post this, if you're listening audio, I post the visual to YouTube if you want to watch the video with the slideshow and everything. Might be a bit easier if you're a bit of a visual learner. And thank you so much. We will see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. We're going to do Sealed. We got a guest on, and we're going to talk some Sealed for those looking to do the Sealed MIQ in a week or two. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.